You can tell a good director in about 5 minutes. Doesn't take longer. If you've been around at all, you spot a director in 5 minutes.
He was a man who believed acting was sacred, a craft that demanded everything. And the moment he stepped onto a screen, the world saw someone different, someone raw, someone real. Richard Widmark arrived in Hollywood like a whisper, not a shout, and in his very first movie scene, he pushed an elderly woman down a staircase while laughing like a man possessed. That single moment changed everything. But before that unforgettable entrance, before the studios wanted him, before the fame and the films and the 5 actors he would spend decades despising, there was a small-town boy from Minnesota with a dream that seemed impossibly far away. His grandmother loved cowboy movies. She'd take young Richard to the theater 2, sometimes 3 times a week, and while other kids were outside playing, he sat in the dark, mesmerized by the stories flickering across the screen. That was it. That was the moment he knew. He didn't just want to watch movies. He wanted to be part of that world, that magic, that escape. His father, Carl, moved the family constantly for work, from Minnesota to South Dakota, chasing jobs, chasing stability. But what Richard was really chasing was that feeling he'd had in the movie theater, the feeling that there was something more, something bigger, something worth fighting for. By the time he was in high school in Princeton, Illinois, he was class president, a football player, a standout student. He had it all figured out, or so he thought. Then everything changed again. His parents separated. Suddenly, the boy who seemed to have everything was learning what it meant to lose something. But Richard didn't break. He got his scholarship to Lake Forest College, and he was going to study law, to be practical, to be safe. Except there was this girl, Aurora Jean Hazelwood, a fellow drama student with a light in her eyes that matched his own. And when she asked him to be in a play with her, something shifted inside him. He was terrified. What if people judged him? What if he wasn't good enough? But Jean believed in him, and that belief was everything. After college, after staying an extra 2 years to teach drama, Richard made the leap. He packed his bags and moved to New York City in 1938, not knowing what he'd find, only knowing he had to try. And Jean was there too, studying at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. They were doing this together. Richard started booking radio dramas, racing between studios, building a name for himself in an industry that had no idea what was coming. Then came World War II. Richard tried to enlist, but a perforated eardrum kept him stateside while his younger brother Donald was drafted and sent to Europe. In 1943, everything broke. Donald's plane was shot down over the Netherlands. He was the only survivor, and he spent more than a year in a German prison camp. When Donald came home, he wasn't the same. Nobody knew how to fix what had been broken in him. The chronic headaches, the paralysis that set in, the slow deterioration. Richard watched it all and felt helpless. In 1955, at only 37 years old, Donald died from a brain tumor. Richard never really forgave the government for not recognizing what the war had stolen from his brother, from their family, from the world. But in 1945, while Richard was still watching his brother suffer, his own life took a turn that would define him forever. Director Henry Hathaway thought he had the wrong look for the role. Too intelligent, too refined, too much forehead. The guy who was supposed to be a cold-blooded killer didn't look like a killer at all. But Darryl F. Zanuck, the executive at 20th Century Fox, believed in him. Zanuck pushed for Richard, and Richard got the part. Hathaway was angry about it, and that anger followed Richard onto the set every single day. He was difficult, obstinate, determined to prove that Richard didn't belong there. And then Richard walked into his first scene and pushed an elderly woman down a staircase while laughing like he was unraveling from the inside out. The laugh, God, that laugh, was unforgettable. It was chilling. It was terrifying. It was brilliant. That single scene earned him an Academy Award nomination and a Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer. But here's what's impossible. That was his first movie, his first scene in his first film, and he'd already done something most actors spend entire careers trying to achieve. Richard later joked about it, saying he thought acting was easy after that and hadn't won anything since. But privately, he admitted that seeing himself on screen terrified him. He felt like shooting himself, yet audiences couldn't look away. They wanted to hate Tommy Udo, and in hating him, they fell in love with Richard Widmark. Fox locked him into a 7-year contract immediately. By 1948, he was unstoppable. Yellow Sky with Gregory Peck, Roadhouse with Celeste Holm, The Street with No Name with Lloyd Nolan. He was everywhere, and every role was different. Every performance stripped something from him and gave something back. By 1950, he was working with Elia Kazan, his old Broadway friend, on Panic in the Streets. But the film struggled. Production costs in New Orleans had bled the studio dry. Then came No Way Out, a daring, racially charged drama where Richard played a vicious racist named Ray Bidd. He didn't want the role. It sickened him. But the studio insisted. Every single day on set, after delivering lines filled with hatred and slurs, Richard would find Sidney Poitier and say, "Sid, you know this is just acting, right?" And Sidney would smile and reply, "Dick, I get it. I'm an actor too." But years later, Sidney revealed the truth. Richard was the first person in Hollywood to invite him to dinner. That simple gesture, that one moment of human decency, meant more than Richard probably ever knew. By 1952, Richard was working alongside Marilyn Monroe on Don't Bother to Knock. He described her as fragile, like a wounded bird. She desperately wanted fame, but the pressure of it was crushing her. She'd lock herself in her dressing room for hours while the crew waited. Her takes seemed chaotic, unpredictable, almost painful to watch. But then they'd edit the footage, and suddenly there was magic. There was something luminous, something real, something that proved why she was unforgettable. The rumors said Marilyn had affairs with her co-stars. Richard was clear about one thing. Not with me. She didn't even flirt. He understood her. He saw her struggle, and he respected it. By 1954, he'd finished his 7-year contract with Fox. He was exhausted, 40 years old and tired of moving from one film to the next without rest, without breathing room. His daughter said he was always a family man who wanted the quiet life on their ranch. He wanted creative control, so he founded his own production company, Heath Productions, named after his daughter's middle name. For a moment, it seemed like things were finally stable. Then his mother died. Just a year after losing his brother, Richard lost his mother too. The world kept taking from him, and Richard kept showing up to set, kept delivering extraordinary performances, kept pretending everything was fine. But he had limits. He had standards. He had a code. And he had no patience for actors who didn't respect the craft. People in the industry whispered about the ones he couldn't stand. 5 names kept coming up. Frank Sinatra was first. Despite all the charm, all the adoration from the public, Richard saw through it. They worked together on The Detective in 1968, and Sinatra was infuriating. Arriving late, wanting scenes done quickly, refusing to rehearse properly. To Richard, acting was sacred. To Sinatra, it looked like just another job. Then there was Marlon Brando. Richard respected his raw talent, even called him brilliant, but he had no patience for the method acting chaos, the refusal to learn lines, the unpredictable moods. They never worked together, but Richard was once heard saying, "Some actors need chaos to create. I prefer focus." Everyone knew who he was talking about. Tony Curtis came next. They worked together on The Long Ships in 1964, and Curtis was all vanity, all mirror time, treating the set like a runway while Richard arrived fully prepared to work. One crew member said Richard didn't dislike Curtis for who he was, but for who he was trying to be. Robert Mitchum was fourth, cool, carefree, always buzzed, never preparing, just showing up and coasting. For Richard, who treated every role like a mission, this was infuriating. And finally, Kirk Douglas. Both of them were fierce, intense personalities, and maybe that was exactly why they clashed. Richard felt Douglas always had to dominate, had to be the center of attention, had to overpower every scene. Rumor had it Richard once turned down a major role to avoid working with him, saying, "There's only room for one storm in a scene, and Kirk brings the whole hurricane." Yet Richard never made a public spectacle of his dislikes. He wasn't the type to gossip or stir up scandal. Those who knew him well understood that he simply had strong beliefs, that an actor owed respect to the story, to the audience, to fellow performers. When someone ignored that responsibility, whether out of ego or laziness, it cut him deeply. By the early 1960s, Richard was a Hollywood fixture. In 1961, he starred in Two Rode Together with Jimmy Stewart and Shirley Jones. On set, director John Ford and Jimmy Stewart argued constantly, usually over Stewart's old beaten-up cowboy hat. But Shirley Jones later confessed something surprising. Richard Widmark was the only leading man she'd ever truly fallen in love with. He and Jimmy were so kind, so protective of me, she recalled. Nothing ever happened between us, but maybe that's exactly why I loved him. He was that kind of man. The kind of man who made people feel safe. The kind of man who understood that film was about more than just performance. It was about connection, about trust, about honoring the people around you. By 1997, after his wife Jean passed away from Alzheimer's disease, Richard couldn't bear to stay in the places they'd shared. He sold their ranch and eventually remarried, finding unexpected happiness again. In 2008, at 93 years old, he passed away peacefully at his home in Connecticut. But what remained was a legacy of discipline, integrity, and a sacred belief that acting, real acting, required everything you had to give.